Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the monastery, the open bar of the internet, the world's greatest shit show, and the place where we, the good brothers and sisters of this most holy of temples, seek enlightenment through the drunkest, craziest, and most batshit ways possible. I am your one and only gaming monk, better known as Mildra, and with me I have a newcomer into the temple, creator of Core 20, which we're going to be getting into, which I'm not going to be able to get into everything because this is damn near 900 pages of info, and it's still in its playtest form. The one and only Scott Fitzgerald Gray. How you doing today, man?
I'm doing very well. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for coming on and braving time zone hell. So, one of the traditions around here is opening with the humble beginnings of the sword.
Sure.
So, with that in mind, I'd like you to walk me through your introduction to role-playing games and what made it stink. What made it stick, not stink. English.
Yeah.
What?
My introduction to role-playing games happened, like many of the best things in my life, kind of by accident. My first RPG was AD&D First Edition, so I'm of a generation where I started playing in 1980, fall of 1980.
Mm-hmm.
Before that, I was with a group of friends. My friends and I, we played some war games, not like tabletop, like sand table Napoleonic stuff, but we played a lot of Avalon Hill games. They played Squad Leader, that kind of thing. My favorite game was Kingmaker. We used to play a lot of Kingmaker back in the day.
Mm-hmm.
When they played Squad Leader, I would just kind of hang out and read comics and watch them play because I wasn't as into the World War II simulation setup as them, but I loved the historical stuff, sort of the older things.
Yeah.
And about that time, a friend of ours, here's the context for this is I grew up in a small town in Western Canada of 2,000 people. So, we were very much sort of like a clique unto ourselves. There was nobody else around us.
So you
who
had
was
to
sort of
deal with
interested in the
So you had to deal with the plague of Oilers fans.
Canucks fans, mostly actually,
Oh,
in
that's
BC.
even worse.
But yeah, so we just kind of did our own thing. We didn't pay that much attention to what other people were doing. But an interesting thing happened because a friend of ours who'd lived in the town with us, at some point moved back down to Vancouver, the big city in British Columbia,
Mm-hmm.
for a little while when his parents moved down. And we kept in touch with him and he came back up to visit from time to time. And one of the times when we were talking to him, he said, I've been playing this game called Dungeons and Dragons, and it's amazing. And another friend of mine, Dave, and I went down to visit this one friend at one point in Vancouver, Kevin. And we were sitting around and we were asking him, what's this game like that you were talking about? And he says, it's like this and this, and you play a character. And it was one of those things like many, many people, their first time gaming, they have this story of someone trying to explain the game to them and that doesn't really make sense, but you just say, you know what, I'll just show you.
Mm-hmm.
But the interesting thing about this game was that he didn't have any of his books with him at the time we were hanging out. So he basically made up a version of Dungeons and Dragons on the fly as he remembered it. And that's what we played. That was my very first session.
Mm-hmm.
So we had some paper lying around. We wrote down numbers on that, tore them up to make chits, threw them into a bag. He talked about, okay, if you want to make an attack roll, you need to get, X or higher. If a dragon breathes on you, you need to make a saving throw. You need to get Y or higher, that kind of thing. And he just basically whipped up an adventure off the top of his head. We made characters without even knowing how to build characters. He just said, okay, here's your ability scores and this is what you're good at. If you're a warrior, this is what number you need to hit something. If you're a magic user, this is what spells you got. I have a vague recollection that Dave and I were probably both playing like fighter magic users or fighter clerics maybe.
Mm-hmm.
And we played this little adventure. I've again a vague recollection. I wish I had the notes and stuff from that night, but I have a vague recollection of there was an entrance into a cavern entrance into a hillside, and beyond that the path forked in sort of one direction. One cavern, one passageway went left, and one passageway went right. And as he was describing us, our characters standing there at night in the moonlight, looking at this and asking us what we want to do, I absolutely knew that I had never felt anything like that before, and that I was never going to be able to stop looking for that feeling again for the rest of my life. It was a profound mental sea change. I
Mhm.
mean, I was a person at that point. I read, fantasy fiction and speculative fiction voraciously, read a lot of comics back in those days, watched a lot of movies. None of those things were like what that very first role-playing session did for me. The way that it made me feel. And that was an astounding revelation to me, that there was something that was so absolutely unique and so absolutely distinct from all of the other forms of creativity that I had followed and that I had loved up to that point.
Yeah. Now, with that in mind, we fast forward to the development of Core 20. Was this a case of you just house ruling a given system until to the point of it becoming its own thing?
That is exactly it. Yeah. With the idea that I never really thought about it becoming its own thing. That was never really the intent of it. If that had been the intent, certainly the game probably would have come out a lot sooner, and I would have done a lot more work on it
Mhm.
with that goal in mind. But the incentive for Core 20 came about actually because of the weird juxtaposition of my first two RPGs. Right after that session where I was sort of introduced to the concept, I immediately picked up the Holmes Blue Box, which I read cover to cover, like
Mhm.
in a matter of hours. Um, Loved it completely. But before I had a chance to play it, my friend Dave met another kid who was at our high school and who was new, and noticed he had a copy of the AD&D Player's Handbook. So we started hanging out with him, a guy named Mitch. And so Holmes was the first version I read. AD&D was the first game that I played. The second game that I played, though, was Traveler, which Kevin introduced us to about a year after that.
And probably died in
And
character creation.
a couple of times, yeah. But the cool thing about Traveler was like AD&D, much like every version of D&D since then, it's a rigorously class-based system. Class and levels are sort of that defines the progression of your characters and the shape of the game. Traveler took a completely different approach where there was no levels. There were classes kind of, but not really. You had certain
Archetypes.
specializations that could make you, yeah, archetypes that you could be good at. You could say, I think I want to be mostly, this is what I want to focus on, combat versus
Mhm.
navigation versus other stuff, right? And that kind of thing. But I loved the idea. I loved the difference between the two games. I loved the way that Traveler enabled you to build a character with a little bit more flexibility, and like you could personalize them a little bit more, right? AD&D especially didn't have a lot of differences between, like there were no subclasses in the sense that 5e players know
Yeah.
them. So
There
if you
were
played a fighter in
there were
AD&D,
kits, but
there were kits were like several
weird.
years after when I
Okay.
was playing. So we were playing first edition. First edition had very little in the way of options aside from magic items, though
Hmm.
that was your main road to customization. And so I
Okay.
thought to myself, playing Traveler, loving Traveler, but still playing AD&D and loving AD&D, it would be really cool for someone to make a version of D&D that had no classes and no levels. And this was like literally in 1982 or 1983 that thought stuck in my head.
Hmm.
And I just assumed that at some point, because it seemed like such an obvious, brilliant idea, somebody would come up with it. Somebody would write that game. And so I just, as I kept playing games, I kept waiting for someone to write that game. And I waited and I waited and I waited. And there's lots of other games that are free form character building games. I mean, GURPS is obviously the one that comes to most people's minds. There's been all sorts of different approaches to the same idea, but none of them that I saw and that I investigated really did what I wanted them to do. Right? They weren't that idea of I want it to feel like D&D, but I want it to be a game where I'm building my character basically in a very free form fashion. Right? So when I at some point, like fast forward way back, I'd started working on D&D for Wizards of the Coast as a freelancer back in 2004. So even then, I was still kind of waiting for someone to write this game for me, and got to a point where I realized no one was going to do it, and I decided I might as well just take a shot at doing it myself. And the inspiration for that was partially my friend Dave, who was that player who was with me one of the first game session I ever played. We were still playing in a regular play by post game at that point,
Hmm.
And he was building a Ranger and wasn't quite happy with some of the options. So we looked at different prestige classes. This was during the 3.5 days and
Yeah.
different things. And I pitched him the idea of there was an urban Ranger that Rob Schwalb wrote up in one of the Thieves World books that he worked on for Green Ronin, which I had edited. And that was sort of, that was more kind of, getting into what Dave was looking for, but it still wasn't quite right. And we were talking about, can we swap out some class features and stuff? And I said, let me think about this for a bit and maybe I can come up with something. And in the course of thinking about that, the key sort of foundational mechanics of Core 20 in terms of how to turn what had been class features in D&D up to that point into a free range of features that anybody can take. That kind of fell out of my head. And that was the point at which I started thinking, okay, this could be something really cool.
Yeah.
But at the outset, it was just, as you say, house rules. We were playing 3.5 and I just said, here's some house rules for 3.5. Everything else is the same. Spells are the same. Magic items are the same. We're just looking at building characters in a different way. And that's what the game remained for a couple of years when we first started it.
Mm-hmm. Part of the reason I made that guess is because I've seen that story before.
Sure.
One of the most arguably the most famous example of that kind of story of house rules leading to a whole new game would be Rollmaster.
Sure.
That started out as a collection of AD&D house rules known as Arms Law, then spiraled into just being its own game. If you look back at Rollmaster, even Merc, you can still see some of that DNA in there. And I know that Chivalry and Sorcery, that was also what ended up happening. It was starting out as a bunch of house rules because the creator of it wasn't satisfied with how medieval life was represented within D&D, so he decided to do something about it himself.
Sure.
In the past, I've covered things like Legend System that was part of the Test of Spite challenge on Giant in the Playground, and then just morphed into its own thing. How my own project is a case of starting out as house rules and then not ending at house rules. So, point is that particular phenomenon is in good company. And
absolutely, yeah.
I'm pretty sure that there's going to be. I'd say a recent example would be City of Mist. Like the first City of Mist, it says it's based on Powered by the Apocalypse, but it barely is. Like it,
right?
Like it's only on the faintest margin that it counts as such. And by the time you get the follow-ups like Tokyo Otherscape or the upcoming Legend into the Mist, it has stopped having any association with Powered by the Apocalypse and is exclusively its own thing.
Yeah. I think that's true of a lot of things, like not just RPGs. I mean, people, in fiction and film, and also there's when we create things, we tend to sort of work on two different axes. One is we take stuff that we're inspired by and we think, oh, I'd like to do something like this. And then we take stuff that we look at and we go, this didn't quite work for me. I'd like to do something better than this.
Mm-hmm.
And those two sort of forces, kind of push us in brand new directions. And I think that's one of the things that makes RPGs in particular really, really cool. Because you can see these lines, these threads of evolution, from the original source material.
Yeah, I've talked about this in the past, but one particular paradigm shift that ended up happening in RPG design was the idea of a unified resolution mechanic. Because if you look at like AD&D or some of the early purveyors, you have that same isolated series of resolution mechanics for different situations. This is where you get things like roll high for certain things and roll low for others.
Right.
Which is a artifact of the wargaming scene.
For sure.
And then at some point, maybe in the late 80s, early 90s, I can't really say when this happened, you started to see a shift towards having an all roads lead to Rome concept with the resolution mechanic. Like a core, a lot of games that have come out in the last 30 years have had this one core resolution mechanic and then slight variations on that core mechanic. Hence, all roads lead to Rome.
Yeah. It's a difference, I think, between having a sense of a game being a collection of kind of, small subsets as opposed to one core from which you split other things off. And I think, I mean, because a lot of games were inspired by AD&D as the sort of the progenitor RPG, AD&D was definitely a system of subsets of rules and kind of mini games strapped to each other
Yeah.
in some ways, as an extension of how the game grew and evolved out of its wargaming roots.
Hmm.
And I think like the time frame you talk about makes sense because I think it takes a certain number of years of playing that way for you to think about, maybe there's a better way, not even a better way, but maybe there's just a different way of doing this,
Yeah.
and experimenting with things that just for the sake of experimenting with them.
Hmm. Now, it is funny that you bring up GURPS, especially in relation to the very skill-based design that you have with Core 20.
Sure.
And that's because I've given GURPS stands a fair amount of shit over the years, admittedly, because I've seen a fair amount of them snow people on the notion of, oh, you can use GURPS to run anything,
Right.
which I've always described it as that being the equivalent of your kid wanting a Disney princess doll for Christmas and you give them a Princess Leia action figure. You're technically correct, but you kind of missed the
Sure.
point.
Yeah.
Huh.
Yeah.
Because technically speaking, can you run anything with a universalist system like GURPS? Yes, but that comes at a price. There's a lot more moving parts, so the GM has to be a lot more involved. So there's
Right.
always going to be a higher floor with those kind of games.
Yeah.
And that's not a slam on it. It's more, I wish people who were doing the whole, oh, you can run anything with this game, were a little more honest
Right.
about that kind of thing.
Yeah. I think for a lot of people, I mean, certainly everybody has their own reasons why they love particular games, and
Hmm.
everyone has their own games that they really really want to defend and really really want to expose other people to, especially games that aren't as popular as some of the bigger games. But I think the one thing that's almost universally true for RPGs is that people who love an RPG know the system well enough that they know how to make it do things that aren't automatically intuitive to everyone else.
Yeah.
So when somebody says, "Oh, GURPS is great for running, this particular type of game," when people say things like AD, like D&D 5e works just great for running mysteries, right? They're not lying per se, and it's not that they are unaware that there are other games that are much more dedicated to running
Mhm.
that style of story and that have a much more robust tool set for running
Yeah.
those particular types of stories, right?
Hmm.
It's just that they know the system well enough that they know how they can adapt it to do exactly what they want to do.
And
But that becomes a problem when it doesn't automatically translate to the players who jump into, like a 5e mystery campaign. And
mhm.
it doesn't quite feel like that episode of Sherlock that they watched last week.
Yeah.
The structure of the story doesn't quite fit the way they want it to because they're not
Mhm.
because they themselves are not familiar with how to massage the mechanical framework of the game in order to make that story happen.
Yeah. I know some people say just house rule it. Well, I don't know about you, but I don't like my steak covered in pepper. Um, House ruling is a spice, but the 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 thing is, it's for that reason that I take a tailor approach.
Sure.
If you go to get fitted for a suit, you're going for a particular kind of occasion with a particular style, and it's the tailor's job to find something that's right for what the client is asking for.
Sure.
Uh, and the because of that, the first thing I had to get rid of was the notion of one game is going to be good for everybody.
Sure.
Uh, and there's some that I like that I know I'm not going to recommend to certain people, and there's some that I don't. Uh, but when it comes to doing things in a more freeform manner, that is one of those double-edged swords,
Right.
because you do have a lot of freedom and a lot of versatility in what you can build, but it also runs the risk of analysis paralysis. This is
Yeah.
part of the reason why I say, if there's any one genre that seems to have the biggest culprits of this kind of thing, it's supers, because of all the
Right.
stuff that they have to account for.
Yeah.
But with Core 20, since this is largely skill based, and and largely in that freeform manner, how do you manage that analysis paralysis issue? Not get rid of it, you can never get rid of it, but
Sure.
how do you manage it so it
Yeah.
doesn't become as
There's a
much of
couple
an
of
issue?
different Yeah, there's a couple of different ways. Before I answer though, can I just ask for a point of clarification? When
Mhm.
you talk about the rules as being skill based, what exactly do you mean by that? Because I think that means something slightly different to you than it might mean to me.
Um, what I mean by that is focusing more on skills, as opposed to focusing more on skills and the distribution of um the spread of skills, as opposed to building it around, say, defined
Okay,
classes or defined archetypes.
gotcha.
That's what I
Gotcha.
mean.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Cool. Yeah. So when you're saying skills, I think what you mean when you say skills, I would translate to like features or abilities, just because there is skills are a part of the game in terms of the specific things that your character can be good at, like things
Hmm.
like athletics, acrobatics, the standard skills, and all that sort of thing,
Hmm.
right? But yeah, I mean, what the original version of Core 20 basically took all of the class features, not all of most of the class features of D&D 3.5, broke them out, rewrote them, turned them into what, in the parlance of the game, are called feats, right? And the feats in Core 20 are analogous to feats in D&D 3.5, which were effectively just class features that any class could take. They
Yeah,
weren't
they
attached to
were
any class.
an
They were sort
evolution.
of free floating. Yeah,
They
but they are
Mhm.
very much unlike fifth edition feats. So, like, if for 5e players who are kind of like, oh, I know what a feat is, yes, but that's not what a core 20 feat is. A core 20 feat is much more focused and not as broad, not as
Yeah.
powerful, because you can take much more of them. But
Hmm.
um, there's a couple of different ways to deal with that. One is just the idea that if you're coming in to play the game, you probably have a pretty good sense of what you want your character to be to start with,
Hmm.
right? You have a sense of, I want to play a warrior. I want to play someone who's really tough in combat in some particular way. I want to do someone, I want to play someone who's got a certain amount of panache. I want to play someone who uses magic, but that's not their primary thing that they do. Or I want to play someone who's just absolutely focused on arcana. That's the only thing they know. It's the only thing they love. Everything else, nothing else means anything to them, right?
Hmm.
So having that sense of who you want your character to be is certainly a great starting point. But that said, if you don't know the system, the challenge is trying to figure out which parts of the book, you know, um, uh, will help you build that character as opposed to another character. So the building a character chapter in the book breaks down into a number of different approaches, very, very specifically, right? There's three basic ways you can build a character. One, the easiest one, is the setup of what are called iconic builds. And sort of ironically, considering this is a classless game, what an iconic build allows you to do is to basically build a character that looks very much like a standard fantasy character class, right? You can
Yeah.
build a warrior, which is the same as the fighter. You can build an arcanist, which is the sorcerer, the wizard. You can build a scoundrel,
Yeah.
which looks and feels a lot like the rogue, and so on and so forth, right?
Yeah.
So if you've got a sense of, this classic archetype that I'm drawn to, that's where you start. And it'll basically tell you, as a starting character, you get 20 feat slots, and you use those 20 feat slots to select 20 feats. You basically buy feat slots are the currency you use to buy the feats that
Hmm.
define what your character can do. And the iconic builds basically just say, here's your 20. Take them, start playing, you're good to go, right? With the idea that you can always fine tune that if you want to. So if you're looking at the 20 and you go, I actually don't need this thing, you can not take that and you can freely take something else. And there's a section in the building a character chapter that says, if you've got leftover feat slots and you want to, some ideas to spend them on, here's some options, right?
Hmm.
The second option is what's called feat packages, which are a little bit different. What they are is sort of breaking the game down into different sections like skills. All right, for example, like whether that's thievery or expertise or acrobatics, depending on whether your character, is smart, is social, is physically powerful, right? And so it breaks the options, breaks the feats down into those options, and then for each of those options, you get a certain number of packages, which is just like a collection of feats that you can take, and each number of feats has a fixed cost with it. So you can say, for example, if I want to build an archer character, right? There's an archer package, and the archer package costs you 5 feat slots, and it tells you exactly which feats you're going to take, and you spend 5 on that, and you're good to go. So you can build a character not as one sort of iconic list of feats. You can build a character out of these packages. You can say, I'm going to take 5 for combat. I'm going to take 3 for skills, or maybe I want to actually be more skillful. I'm going to take 5 for skills and 3 for combat. And you can sort of weigh what each of them does against each other, and you can sort of build a customized character that way quite quickly, right? And the third option, of course, is just build it totally freeform. And that's the one where if you've played the system for a little while, you get a sense of how the game works. You get a sense of sort of like what feats are available. That's where most people start. Like any of the players that I've played with in my home games, even brand new players, I've got in one of my weekly games, I've got 3 brand new players. They've never played Core 20 before. And all of them took the freeform build approach. They were just like, yeah, I'm just going to leaf through the book, figure out what I want to do. They asked me a lot of questions like, hey, if I want to do this, what would I take? And I just tell them, look at X, Y, and Z, right? And yeah, that's for most people, the fun of the game is figuring out how to build the exact character that you want to build. But for people who are going to be overwhelmed by that, the other 2 options, the iconic builds and the feat packages are there. They make a really, really good, very intuitive, and very quick way of building a character who feels, unlike a typical character, and who feels like this is something I'm building because this fits the sense of who my character is, as opposed to most class-based games where you're like, I have a sense of who the character is, and then you try to figure out which class will get closest to that, even though you often won't get exactly what you're looking for.
Mm-hmm. Now, the way you describe the iconic builds,
Yep.
the thing that comes to mind is the the famous set of pre-gen builds that have been in most of the editions of Shadowrun over the years.
Sure.
The Street Sam, the Combat Mage, the Drone Rigger, the Rat Shaman, that kind of thing.
Right.
And of course the Weapon Specialist, who has weapons for their weapons. But give and I'm guessing things like the feat packages are kind of the in between full freeform and the iconic builds.
Exactly. Yeah. Like the feat packages exist because you may have a sense of what you want your character to do. You know that you don't just want to take an iconic build. You're like, yeah, I want to play a warrior, but I want to play a warrior with a little bit of a difference. Like there's a reason why I wouldn't want this character to just be a stock fighter, for example. If I was playing if I was playing D&D 5e.
Mm-hmm.
So what the feat packages do is sort of explain to you just with a tiny little bit of flavor text, if you want to be good at such and such, this is the package for you, right? If you want to be good at this other thing, this is the package for you.
Yeah.
So you can read that little bit of detail without even digging into what the feats are, just to get a sense of, oh, okay, I think this package sounds good. I think this package sounds good. Once you make that decision, you can go through and actually look at the feats and what they do mechanically for you. So you're focusing on the mechanics second when you look at feat packages. You're really focusing on the feel of the character. And that's really pretty fundamental to what you want to do when you're building a Core 20 character.
Yeah, there's really 2 major schools of thought when it comes to character building in games. There is the put in the stats first and then build a character off of that, and the reverse.
Yeah.
But it is funny with how you describe the differences between feats in 3.5 and 5e, since, well, not to go too far into it, but I I got myself in a bit of trouble because I said the way feats work in 5e were a masterclass in kind of missing the point. Uh, and the big reason I said that is, and I don't know, you'd likely know more than I would because you were on the other side of the glass, but I was always under the impression that the introduction of feats in 3rd edition was a means to personalize that was building off of the proficiency concept that was at the tail end of AD&D 2nd.
Mm-hmm.
I don't have any proof that's what actually happened, but there is a natural enough progression that I could see it happening. And
Yeah.
5e's feats and having them be an alternative to ASI unfortunately ends up requiring certain classes to have feats in all but name, like say the invocations that Warlock have, because you're limiting feats to just every 4 levels, and the stuff you get out of feats it can't outdo the ASI improvement. Right. So it's in this no man's land where it's not powerful enough to justify the limited slots, and without it, you don't, unless you're playing a caster, you don't have a whole lot of ways to customize, which is something that was a problem in the past. And then it was fixed for a bit, and then it became a problem again.
Yeah. I can't answer that question for certain because I don't know much about aside from, the interviews that I read and listen to.
Mm-hmm.
Don't know a whole lot about the design process, of how 3rd edition was put together. The one thing I can say though, I think that feats in 3rd edition probably had less to do with any specific existing 2nd edition mechanic than they had to do with just this sense of what can we do that's an interesting way to customize characters that would fit with this brand new system that we're doing, right? I mean, one of the big differences between 3rd edition and previous editions was 3rd edition class features were pretty robust, right? Everybody got something every level or 2 or 3. It was an interesting thing, made the character interesting, made the character more fun to play, ideally, right?
The jump from 2nd to 3rd had a lot of unification.
Definitely, yeah.
Instead of that whole, like I said, instead of that whole collection of subsystems, you have all roads lead to that D20, which was kind of already happening, but it was a case of one foot out the door at that point.
Feats and sorry, go ahead.
But as much of a step forward as it was, it did have the problem of certain traps, and I think this is something you tried to avoid with your feat system. Prerequisites being a little bit excessive at times.
Right. Yes. Yeah. Feat trees in 3rd edition were definitely something that felt like a vestige of the kit setup in 2nd edition, maybe, or maybe just something that seemed like a good idea at the time in terms of saying, okay, you're going to let players choose a particular feat tree in exactly the same way that they might choose a prestige class, right? This is going to be something that you commit to, right? I think feats in general in 3rd edition were about the idea of, we've got these character classes. Is there a way we can let players have just a baseline option, something that they don't have to, something that's less mechanically intrusive into your character progression than a prestige class would be, right? And they're pretty, they're pretty open, right? So any class, like a character of any class might be able to take this particular feat within certain limitations. I mean, the place where you see that in 3rd edition most acutely is the fighter, right? Because the fighter didn't just get the feat every 4 levels that everybody gets. The fighter got fighter bonus feats, right, continuously.
And
so
unfortunately, unfortunately, new feats had to be listed whether or not they counted as fighter bonus feats, which was
for sure
a bit of a failure to future-proof, in my opinion.
Yeah, but I mean, playing a fighter in 3rd edition was fun from the perspective of you could play a fighter and you could customize that fighter pretty well. You could make that fighter feel different than everybody else's fighter, which is something that AD&D, 1st edition AD&D had never done, right? 2nd edition had done with the advent of kits, right? But this was a this I think this I expect this was intended to feel like an easier way to kind of get that feeling as a player, saying, "Oh, this is cool. I can make this character my own," right? By choosing custom feats. The issue, of course, is that I mean, this is sort of part and parcel of just the necessity of owning a game that you want to keep making new books for. Every new book that comes out has to have new feats in it because that's what players expect. And at some point, you start really feeling hamstrung in terms of, okay, there are so many feats in the game. 5 years into the life cycle of third edition, this new book we're doing, we know we have to put some new feats in it. What's left, right? And so feats and other mechanical options start to get more particular and more nuanced and more idiosyncratic because they can't quite cover something that's already been done, right? But I think that like most things in games, things that start out seeming like really, really cool ideas and that feel fairly straightforward can become complicated simply by virtue of continually needing to revisit them and to sort of try to put a new spin on them and to try to do things from a slightly different perspective.
Hmm. Yeah, I can get that. And for me personally, um, when it came to fighters, there was it wasn't until a little ways into it that I figured out how to really make the fighter work in order to actually be a battlefield menace, because there were a lot of feats in third edition and to a lesser extent 3.5 that were basically traps. And I will also note, when it came to requirements, my whipping boy has always and always will be whirlwind attack,
Oh, for course. Yeah.
just because of the sheer amount of stuff you need to get. So you have a bunch of false choices as you level up.
Yeah. Whirlwind attack is an example, one of the things where you choose the end point, like of where you want to go, and then you figure out what path you're going to take to get there.
Mhm.
And that's kind of antithetical to the idea of, I think, what feats were maybe supposed to be, which is just, oh, at every level, I should be able to choose something cool. As opposed to, oh, I know that 10 levels from now, I want to choose this thing, which is the apex,
I
feat that I absolutely need to get. So now I got to take all this other stuff, whether it really fits the character concept or not.
I had always described feats as the little tricks you pick up in your adventuring career, and this is where there's an interesting thing with how levels worked from the transition from one edition to the other. There's maybe this is just me, but it seemed like for a good amount of AD&D, the theming was around balancing the classes across a whole campaign, like balancing
Yes.
across the 15 or so levels, or more than that, depending on edition you're going with. I don't feel like breaking out the Immortals Handbook again. I'm I don't have enough alcohol for that.
Yeah.
But third edition onward, there seemed to be the attempt. How successful the attempt was, I'll leave up to you, to build more towards balancing each one out at given individual levels, i.e., go
Yeah.
balancing horizontally instead of vertically.
Yeah. I think that's true to a certain extent, but I don't think we really saw that put into that paradigm put into place until 5th edition. One of the most wonderful things about 3rd edition, the thing that I love about 3rd edition more than just about anything else, is the idea that 3rd edition was a completely new expression of the same rules that AD&D had been working with in 1st and 2nd edition in a certain way, from a certain perspective. 3rd edition was very different in many, many ways, right? Its monster design in particular got very, very complicated. Monsters in 3rd edition are way beyond anything that AD&D was doing. The AD&D Red Dragon, the ancient Red Dragon in AD&D had 88 hit points. So
Mhm.
you can compare that to anything in the later versions to just sort of see how more robust monsters got. But when you looked at the old combat tables in the 1st edition Dungeon Master's Guide, and when you looked at what Thaco was doing in 2nd edition, and you look at the base attack bonus in 3rd edition, those numbers are basically exactly the same, right? It's the same progression through the game of power, right? And that was pretty amazing to me. And I think that was an interesting decision that they made when they did third edition, where they said, okay, we got this game, and this game seems to work because people have been loving it for, this many years now. Let's not mess around with that. Let's just find a much better, much clearer way to express what D&D does. So you did things like, having ascending AC as opposed to descending AC, because that just makes so much more sense. You had things like clarifying that everything is a D20 roll and you add something to it and you want to get high, right? The higher the number, the better, as opposed to having different things in AD&D where sometimes high was good, sometimes low was good, right? But the rules are effectively the same. And in third edition, you can still see the vestiges of that, balance over the whole campaign idea that as you put it, the idea that at lower levels, wizards are really squishy, right? And they are not very powerful, and they get very powerful at higher levels. Whereas fighters start out pretty powerful, but at a certain point, right? Even though they gain in power, wizards definitely start to bypass them, right? Third edition had the thing that AD&D had, where arcane spells, wizard and sorcerer spells, generally will deal more damage at a particular level than a clerical spell or a druid spell will. And there were rules in the Dungeon Master's Guide talking about, like, if you're making your own spells, be aware of that fact, right? So an arcane spell of level 5 will on average deal this much damage, but a clerical or a druid spell of level 5 will deal less damage, because that's not what clerics and druids are about.
Yeah.
Right? There's like an interesting paradigmatic difference between these sets of classes and between these two forms of magic, right? Divine magic versus arcane magic. Divine magic is really good at some things. Arcane magic is really good at other things. And that was a part of third edition as much as it was a part of AD&D, I think. Now, fifth edition changed that. Fifth edition absolutely locked in the idea of, we want every class to feel balanced across every level. I mean, fifth inherited that from fourth edition to some degree, right? Because that was absolutely a key paradigm of fourth edition design.
If that's the
But
case,
just
I
did it
think
in a
they
very, very
if that's the case, I'm not sure if they fully understood it, because they ended up repeating old they ended up repeating old problems. Like,
yeah, for
the
sure.
linear warrior quadratic mage has been a problem for years. And it's, while it isn't as bad as it was in older eras, in
Right.
5e it is still a problem.
Yeah.
It comes down to somebody's going to feel like the third wheel if they feel like they're a one-trick pony is the thing.
Yeah. I think there's two different ways to look at game balance, right? One is the sheer mechanics of it. You say, okay, at level X, each character class should be capable of dealing Y damage per round in a fight, right? Whether that's like a fighter doing multiple attacks and action surge, whether that's a wizard casting casting spells at a certain level, or upcasting their lower level spells to get equivalent damage, right? And there's nothing wrong with that, right? Except, as you point out, if you're shooting for mechanical balance that way, you inevitably will miss something out, and you'll suddenly realize, oh, right, the way that people are actually playing the game, the numbers they're coming up with are quite different than we had anticipated them. That was a big problem in fourth edition, right? They set out some really, really strong math, and they said, yep, this is the way it should work. And people started playing, and they realized, no, this is not the way it's actually working at the table, and this is a huge problem, right? But I think there's another approach to balance, and that's on a more narrative level. The idea is simply of, does my character and their choice of class and subclass and whatever other options are available, feats, ability score increases, magic items, what have you, does each character have an equivalent opportunity to do cool and interesting things in the game, right? And I think that's a more interesting question for me. And I think it's a more interesting approach to think about design from that perspective. One of the things that I won't say it bothers me, because I know what game D&D is, right? I've been playing D&D for 42 years now, right? I absolutely understand, what the game is about and how it works. And I understand, and in saying that, what that means is I understand that D&D is a game about combat. D&D is a game where, on some level, you reduce everything down into numbers. How many hit points does your side have? How many hit points does the other side have? what abilities do you have, what opportunities do you have to lower the other side's hit points, and what opportunities and abilities do they have to lower your hit points, and who gets there first, right? That's effectively what the game is in a nutshell when you think about D&D as being a combat-focused game, right? A game of, good heroes fighting evil, right?
Mm-hmm.
But one of the things that always nagged at me about D&D, and this was something that became, when I started thinking about Core 20, became a very core paradigm, was the idea that wouldn't it be fun to play a character and just simply decide how good you wanted to be at combat, right? And that's something that on some level, third edition and the previous editions, using the same basic, underlying math, did a slightly better job of than fifth edition, right? In third edition, your fighter had a better attack bonus than the rogue, like 100% of the time, right? Because the fighter's base attack bonus progression went faster than the rogues did, right? Fighters were better at attacking than clerics, better than druids, but clerics, druids, and rogues were all better than wizards and sorcerers, right? And those numbers, if you got into high levels, the gap between them would start to widen, right? There was this idea that if you're playing a rogue, you want to look for targets that are easier to hit, right? Because you know that even though you don't hit as hard as the fighter, once you do hit, the damage you're dealing, if you're setting up your sneak attack, makes you just as formidable,
Mm-hmm.
right? The fighter was the person who's like, I'm going to look for the tankiest, boss I can find because that's what I'm good at, right? And fifth edition switched away from that when it switched over to the sense of bounded math, right? And the idea of a proficiency bonus that's a fixed number and it's exactly the same for all classes. And even though there are differences, right? If you're playing a fighter, then you get bonuses to your attack from this subclass or from this feature, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, magic plays a part, but magic is usually pretty even between the classes in terms of what kind of advantage you can get from it. But in fifth edition, your rogue and your warrior hit about as effectively, right? They do their damage in different ways, right? Fighters get more attacks, rogues deal more damage with sneak attack. But the idea with fifth edition is that it should feel pretty much the same running those two. And that's something that I think I absolutely understand it from a mechanical perspective. I understand why that design exists. I understand why that is good design because it is very good design. But there's a part of me that misses the idea of saying it's okay for characters to be different at the things that they're really good at, right? And one of the ideas behind Core 20 was saying you should be able to build a character who, if you don't want to be good at combat in any way, you have that freedom,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because in any version of D&D, even the versions where your fighter was outstripping the rogue and the cleric, if you're playing a 10th level cleric, right, you've got a base attack bonus that lets you, dismember commoners with your bare hands if that's what you want to do, right? It's impossible in D&D to not be good at combat, even if you don't have any
Yeah.
interest in being good in combat, right? That's a
Yeah.
feature of the system.
Yeah, and
And that was one.
I look at
Sorry, go
that. I
ahead.
look at that kind of thing as because I've seen people do the whole. Oh, we want to run D&D, but we don't want to make it combat focused. And I'd end
Right.
up asking the question, why are you running D&D?
Mm,
Uh, if with when you're dealing with a game that is built on the foundation of wargaming and is always going to have that as part of its DNA, the only way to
yeah.
really work around that is to either go with going something that's built around that, because you're not going to see me complain about the lack of combat if I'm running, say, Gumshoe, whether that be
Sure.
Trail of Cthulhu or Esoterrorists or Night's Black Agents, or you build a D20 like where it has that kind of thing in mind, that it isn't meant
Right.
to be focused around that kind of combat. Uh,
Right.
this is if I can't use Gumshoe as an example, I'll bring up Legend of the Five Rings, which has a combat setup, but it is very lethal and very discouraged.
Right.
And whenever I've run L5R over the years, I've had to beat it into people's heads. Do not think that you're doing Seven Samurai. You're doing Game of Thrones in a fantasy Japan. It,
Right.
because it's far more about political intrigue than outright combat.
Right.
Uh, and well, Gumshoe was made because Kenneth Hitt was dissatisfied with games handled investigation. So that's what he built Trail of Cthulhu around, and then you get the rest. Uh, it comes back to that whole thing of building with something in mind versus building as it to try and do a a full sandbox, but you can't do both.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. And this is, thinking about that exact topic. When I first started hatching the ideas for Core 20 and thinking about, mechanically how the system would work. Mechanically, how the system would work was actually a pretty easy thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
Once the idea of how you how you set up a system where taking feats becomes more difficult the better you want to get at something, because that was the big challenge, right? Like when you're playing a class-based game, how good you get at something and how fast you get good at something depends on on simply how fast you level up, right? And that's something that's one thing that changed with third edition pretty drastically from older versions of D&D, and fifth edition hung on to that change very tenaciously, was the idea that in AD&D generally, I think for most people, for most players in most campaigns, you started to level up more slowly the higher level you got, right? Because it took much more experience when you got up to that level. And the challenges that you faced, the experience you won from that didn't go up geometrically, right? So just in terms of game time, like how many weeks you're playing, and also sort of like player time, how many sessions you're playing, right? The higher the level you were, the more time you would spend at that level, right? Because the more experience you needed to earn in order to get to the next level. Third edition effectively decided that leveling should be at one pace, right? And that's something that
Mm-hmm.
5e, I think, did a better job, and there's some great optional rules in the Dungeon Master's Guide talking about, here's how to run a fast advancement campaign, here's how to run a slow advancement campaign. But especially as more and more DMs have moved away from experience in 5e and are just basically using milestone leveling now, there's a real impetus and a real pressure to level up as fast as humanly possible, which makes 5e games go quite quickly, I think, in a lot of cases.
Yeah.
But thinking about Core 20, right? The idea of saying, okay, it's very easy to decide, that in place of like a base attack bonus, or in place of a proficiency bonus, to determine how good you are at combat, you're going to select the feat called Weapon Focus, and Weapon Focus is going to say, okay, each time you take it, you get a +1, right? So you're getting incrementally better at what you do, right? As you train, as you gain an experience, as you just basically adventure. What do you do to make sure that that slows down at some point so that you don't get progression going too fast? Because one of the things that I wanted to do with Core 20 was to mimic to some degree the experience of AD&D the way I used to play it, and the feel of the game when I used to play it. And so coming up with the idea of how to slow down progression at higher tiers was actually a pretty easy thing to do. It came to me pretty quickly. But beyond that, the more interesting idea, sort of underlying the system, was this idea of, wouldn't it be interesting if you could work with the idea that of just, you didn't have to be good at anything you didn't want to be good at, and you could make the choice of saying, I want to be good at this, recognizing that if I want to be really good at this, I'm going to end up losing somewhere else, and having to make a sort of like a real strong decision about what your character's forte was and how comfortable you were with not being as good at other things in order to do that. Um, Talking about the iconic builds, as we were earlier, there's actually two iconic builds. These were two of the last things I think I added to this, to the version of the game before this one, which are effectively non-combat builds, right? They don't have any real combat skill. Now in Core 20, there's no such thing as weapon proficiency. So if you happen to just pick up a sword or a club, quarterstaff, right? You can attack someone with it just using your strength modifier or your dexterity modifier, right? You'll still have a chance to hit. You can still do regular damage. There's no penalties or minuses or anything like that, right? You don't have disadvantage because you don't have proficiency, right?
Mm-hmm.
But these are two iconic builds that are dedicated to doing things that don't involve combat. That's not their forte. It's not meant to be their forte, right? It was a lot of fun to put those together. I actually ran a little test campaign at one point when I wanted to test out a part of the game called combat maneuvers. which were combat options built around the idea of wouldn't it be fun to actually have some combat and to have fun in combat that didn't involve necessarily needing to kill somebody, because that's another one of the baselines of D&D that it inherited from its war game roots.
Mhm.
This idea that you are obligated, if you're playing the game correctly, to try to beat your opponent down to 0 hit points. That's
Yeah.
that's literally how the game is played, right?
Mhm.
And so I set up a little test campaign. It was an urban campaign. It was a mystery campaign, sort of like an investigation. And I said to the players, here's the house rules for this one campaign. Nobody takes any weapon feats. You can do anything else you want. And this campaign will absolutely involve combat because, bad people are going to be looking for you, right? And you're going to be running from them at different points. But you have to think up ways to get out of combat without actually making a stand, drawing your weapons, and trying to beat down the other side. So show me what you can come up with. And these were all people who'd played the system before, so they had a really good sense of kind of how to build characters and stuff. And it was amazing the things they came up with, right? Just these ideas for like so many different ideas for characters who just they know they're going to get into tough scrapes, but they recognize that I'm not going to get out of this tough scrape by drawing a sword and stabbing somebody to death. I got to think of other ways to do it. I had one character who played a sewer worker who was also a wrestler in an underground wrestling ring. So sort of like specialized on grappling and tripping opponents and then running like hell to get away from them.
Mhm.
Had somebody who played had some illusion magic, some innate illusion magic, I think. Wasn't even a spellcaster, but just had magic they could tap into. And their specialization was just creating illusory distractions, right?
Mhm.
To focus, just focus the foe's attention somewhere else in order to, get into somewhere, get out of somewhere, basically, evade, get away from the trouble before the trouble became insurmountable, right?
Mhm.
And there were so many different. I was blown away by how creative the players for that one little campaign got in terms of thinking about this paradigm of wouldn't it be, what if we played D&D but we didn't want to fight, right? What else could you do if you didn't have to dedicate the resources that class-based D&D automatically dedicates to you being good at combat if you decide you don't want to be good at combat?
Yeah. And with the now with that in mind, when it comes to the action economy that you do have with combat, you've leaned more into a action point system rather than the economy of actions that you had with 3.0 or 5. You know.
Not not as such. No, I mean the setup is a little bit different for sure.
Mhm.
But the I mean the action points exist in the game, but those are a different thing. They're the equivalent of the equivalent of what action points were in third edition, the equivalent of what hero points were in Pathfinder, at least Pathfinder 1E. I
All right.
haven't played 2E, right? But the action economy is built around four actions if you count reactions as that. And it's
Mhm.
very much like it's very much a lift from sort of late third edition and fourth edition, which is you've got your standard action, you've got your minor action, you've got your move action, and then you've got a reaction. And those are the four things that you can do every round if you want to. And just as the name suggests, and as anybody who's played third edition knows, the idea like a standard action is the thing that takes most of your focus. A minor action covers all sorts of activities that take less focus. A move action covers all kinds of activities that involve movement, whether it's running, jumping, climbing, um, um, that sort of thing. And a reaction is something that you do in response to somebody else triggering your reaction, right? So it's very straightforward. Everybody will recognize it. The one big difference between that action economy in fifth edition is the difference between the bonus action and the minor action. And I will say that bonus actions are one of the things I'm least crazy about in 5e, because I find it a weird kind of paradigm. This idea that a bonus action isn't like a lesser action. It's just it's an action that involves just as much activity, just as much focus as a regular action in 5e, but you simply either can do it or you don't. Right. And there's no, I find that kind of strange. I find it sort of the paradigm of that feels odd to me. Um, and one of the things that I think for a long time I maintained that fifth edition Fifth edition really could have used a minor action just by virtue of how many people misused bonus actions to turn them into minor actions. Because one of the things about bonus actions in 5e, or at least in 2014 5e, I don't know if they've tweaked it or not for the 2024 rules. But one of the things about bonus actions is you can't simply take a bonus action. You can't simply say, hey, I want to do something on my turn. Can I do that as a bonus action? And have the DM say, yeah, sure. I mean, you can do that because you can do anything you want, but that's technically outside the rules of the game because a bonus action is always something that is given to you by a class feature or by a magic item, right? And yeah, so it's just like things. Yeah, it's Core 20 is built around the idea that you just basically think about what you want to do, right? And it's pretty straightforward which things are standard actions, which are your big focus actions, which things you can do as minor actions, which are your sort of I'll do this, just on the side kind of thing. And there's total flexibility in terms of switching one to the other, right? Like if you want to, for example, if you want to do a perception check in a particular area and you're in combat or some sort of time limited situation, you can say, I'd like to do this as a standard action. I'm going to make all my focus for my turn, looking around to try to see if we're about to be ambushed, right? Or you can say, I got something else I want to do, but I want to make a perception check as a minor action as well. And that's totally fine. But the minor action perception check is going to be less likely to spot what you could have spotted because a minor action automatically is a little bit less focus on your part because you're distracted doing your main thing, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can get that. And I've danced around it for the longest time, but there's one elephant in the room that has decided to break into my house and is crashing on my couch that I have to go into. And that is spellcasting.
Yes.
And this is what now I've had a tumultuous relationship when it comes to magic systems in various editions of D&D. The big elephant in the room, and I always end up getting shit for this, but I'm not the biggest fan of the Vancian model.
Sure.
I was not a fan of it when I started with the black books when I was 10. I.e. the black book era of AD&D second.
Sure.
And that has not changed since.
Yeah.
And of course, as many things that it got right in third edition, there has been a bit of a spell bloat issue that's happened of a bunch of redundant spells. Third edition and Pathfinder are the biggest offenders. Given the approach that you're trying to go with of being more freeform, what was the approach that you wanted to do with the magic system? Because unless I'm mistaken, you're not really because of the fact that you're going freeform for the most part, doing that whole spells per day thing wouldn't quite work as well.
No, it wouldn't. Absolutely. That was one of the first things that got thrown out when I was kind of looking at that. There's two things that are sort of key to the Core 20 magic system, which I'm happy to report kicks Vancian spellcasting in the head pretty firmly. One is the idea that it is not, as you say, a spell slot system. It's not a spells per day system. It is with one except there's one subsection of the magic section, primordial spellcasting, which is, but that's something that may or may not be an optional rule. It's in the playtest right now because I really want to see how people have fun with it because it's been played in a couple of campaigns that I run, and it works really well. But it may be something that at the end of the day feels more like it's part of an optional book or like a later supplement. But notwithstanding that, the main focus of spellcasting is a spell points system. And the spell point system is pretty much adapted directly from the spell point system that appeared for 3rd edition D&D in the Unearthed Arcana book during the 3.5 era. It's a wonderful book, all kinds of cool stuff in there. So spell points have been around for a long time, right? It's an easy conversion, right? So spell points made much more sense than spell slots or spells per day when you're doing sort of like a free form system and you want to be able to sort of pick and choose what you're doing, right? But the thing that goes hand in hand with that, and the thing that makes the spell point system really quite powerful, is the idea that as a caster, you decide which spells you learn, and you learn as many spells as you can get access to. Okay. There's no limitation on, there's a maximum number of spells you can know. There's no sense of, if you know all these spells, then you can't learn any new spells, or you have to wait till you get up to a new level to do that.
Mhm.
It's entirely your choice how many spells you want to go to get access to. It's your choice if you find like a spell book or a scroll as treasure, whether you look at this and go, wow, this is a spell I'd love to learn because it seems really useful, versus I'll never use this. I'll just use the scroll once and that's fine. Right.
Mhm.
And once you learn a spell, you can always cast that spell. You don't have to prepare your spells in Core 20. You are never in a situation, and this is the thing that has driven me crazy. Every time I've played a spellcaster, literally from the first, AD&D spellcaster I ever played to a druid who I was playing in a 5e campaign that ended just a couple of months ago.
Mhm.
The idea of, oh, I've got this spell, and wow, would it be useful right now? Too bad I didn't prepare it. Right?
Yeah, I've seen some
In
people
Core,
try and romanticize the preparing thing of like
I can,
you're preparing your tool set if you're playing Batman, but problem
oh,
is
for
you're
sure,
not
yeah, yeah.
Batman. So
You're not Batman, and you don't. Yeah, I mean, Batman's utility belt conveniently has whatever he needs in it,
mhm.
which is so that model kind of breaks, I think. But
Yeah.
in Core 20, once you learn a spell, okay, there's no having to prepare the spell. You can cast any spell you know,
Mhm.
but you can choose to focus certain spells to make those spells sort of the center of what you're doing. They're sort of at the forefront of your mind. Right, and so focusing spells takes the place of preparing spells in terms of, what your character does during their adventuring day, right? During the long rest, you decide which spells you want to focus. If you cast a spell that's focused, you cast that spell at a cost of 1 spell point per level. And just to as a segue to that, Core 20 spells, instead of going from level 1 to 9, go from level 1 to 18. So they
Mhm.
split up the standard 9 levels of spell casting into 2 levels. Right? So what used to be first level spells in 3rd edition, or what are still first level spells in 5th edition, are now either level 1 or level 2 spells. Level 2 becomes 3 and 4, level 3 becomes 5 and 6, and so on and so forth.
Mhm.
So if your spell is focused, it costs you 1 spell point to cast. If your spell is not focused, you can still cast it, but it costs you double the spell points, right?
Yeah.
2 spell points per level instead of 1.
Mhm.
So you're in a position where you can have sort of the best of both worlds. You can say, I'm going to think strategically, right? I think the following spells will be most useful to me. But you're always in a position where if you're like, oh man, something just happened we didn't anticipate, this one spell that I can cast is going to be really useful, but it's going to cost you more. It's going to eat more into your spell casting resources. So you
Mhm.
get to make a decision about what you want to do about that. Whether you want to cast the spell, right? Potentially risk running out of spell points earlier if you're like in a real slog campaign or a real grinder campaign, right? But you always have access to your magic, because that just seemed like something that made perfect sense to me. That was the thing I liked least about Vancian spell casting. Probably even less than the idea that once you cast a spell, you forget it, right? Is just
Mhm.
the idea that, wait, what do you mean I can't? I have this spell, I know this
Yeah.
spell, but because I didn't expect that we were going to be facing, this particular foe or end up in this particular situation, I had no way to know that I should have prepared it.
Mhm.
Um,
And
Utility spells are the worst ones for that, because there are so many cool, fun utility spells that most casters simply can't afford to memorize, right, or to prepare, because you just think, I can't afford to not have my damage dealing spells. I can't afford to not have my buff spells.
Mhm.
Now, 5th edition did what 4th edition did, and it uses the ritual thing to make that a little bit easier, right? Like if I don't want to prepare detect magic because I can't afford to waste that that spell slot,
Mhm.
you can say, we'll just do it out of combat, and that works okay up to a point. But it always seemed a little bit
Yeah.
cheesy to me. It was like a rule designed to overcome a flaw in the system, as opposed to just
I
doing
like how
something to fix
Valiant
the
handled it. Like how Tales of the Valiant has handled it, where the idea of ritual spells is just this completely different, completely separate avenue compared to your spell slots.
Sure.
You have a certain number of rituals that you know, and a certain number of spells and spell slots that you know, but rituals don't take slots. period.
Right, for sure.
Uh,
Yeah.
and when it comes to that sort of thing, the reason why it's called the Vancian model is because, Gygax and Arneson were big fans of Jack Vance's work.
Yeah.
And
Dying Earth.
the problem that the problem is, I'd venture a good amount of people that played back then and play now have probably not read any of the Dying Earth books. So
Very relatively few, yeah.
use and don't get me wrong, I love the Dying Earth books, but
Yep.
using that as a reasoning for why Magic has to work the way that it does, putting aside
Yeah.
the whole half in, half out regarding what sort of setting D&D is supposed to have,
Yeah.
is it that's an argument that doesn't hold all that much weight,
Yeah.
especially since there's no in-universe reason given.
Yeah.
You look at,
I think
say, all the bullshit that happens with magic in, say, Warhammer. There's a reason given for
mhm,
that. You're messing
sure.
around with chaos. Sometimes when you mess around with chaos, bad shit happens.
Yeah. Yeah. I think one of the things that is really easy to overlook, especially for players who've come to D&D relatively recently,
Mhm.
right? And there are an awful lot of those. The success of fifth edition since 2014 has been pretty amazing to watch, and it's been, for me at least, amazing to see so many new people coming into the hobby. Whether those are people who are sticking with 5e, or whether those are people who are using 5e as kind of their gateway drug into other games. Right? It's a cool thing. I think it's a win-win either way, as far as I'm concerned. But when you try to explain to people that there are so many weird artifacts in the game that exist simply because the game, when it was first created, was played in one very specific way. It was a game about dungeon delving. It was a game where it didn't matter that your first level wizard only had one spell, because it was expected that you would go in, cast that one spell, the fighter would lose 8 hit points, and you would leave again, right? And you would come back a month later after you'd healed up naturally, right? Because your first level cleric didn't have a healing spell at that point, right? Talking about the original D&D at this point, I think AD&D did fix that one thing, right? But the game's resource management is built around this one very specific paradigm, which for a lot of people playing the game that's a style of game they've never played, and they have no reason to play it. Right? It makes absolutely no sense, right? People who think about a dungeon delve now, the idea is, yeah, we're going to go in and then we'll find a place to rest up, and we'll heal and we'll do our long rest and get our hit points back. And you try to explain to them that didn't work back in the day, right? If that was you had to leave the dungeon, right? It was very clear. It was explicitly called out in the rules that that you adventured up to the point where your resources ran out, and then off you went. And Vancian spellcasting, I think, is probably still the strongest vestige of that aspect of the game, even though every other part of that resource management idea is long gone. Right? People heal up faster than they ever did before. Got access to all kinds of healing options. Special abilities, all recharge on a long rest. Right? Just this idea that if I cast a spell, I have to forget it, right? I can't cast it a second time. I have to decide which spells I want to do ahead of time. Yeah, it's a weird holdover from that,
And
because back
choosing,
in the day it
yeah,
worked
yeah,
perfectly, because that was how the game was played. And even though we don't play the game that way anymore, it's still there.
yeah. I've talked about cases where people end up using something because that's what they've always used, but that is a very dangerous feedback loop to go down,
Sure.
especially if a given game ends up changing to the point where that idea doesn't have as much weight as it did.
Yeah.
One of the examples that I've given is I was in a discussion regarding the state of things with the Call of Duty series. I know it's blasphemous by some to be bringing up video games when it comes to tabletop, but the two have a closer relationship than people think. But
Sure.
because I had explained that the reason why things feel so off nowadays compared to in the past when it comes to that series is its tone shifted into something that it was explicitly designed not to do.
Yeah.
It was designed in its earliest days. It was designed to be an anti-power fantasy. You were
Yeah.
not some super soldier. You were just one guy in this massive conflict. As time went on, you start to go into this more action movie route, and you start becoming that super soldier, but the mechanics don't really change to account for this enough.
Yeah.
Uh, and what you end up having is this kind of no man's land.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah,
One
in
of the things that I'm sorry, go ahead.
in the same vein, early D&D was very much doubling down on micromanaging your resources, almost borderline a survival horror game.
Yeah.
And as things evolved into more of a heroic fiction kind of affair, uh, less of trying to be Conan and more trying to be Lord of the Rings, as it were. Nothing wrong
Right.
with either of them, but they're two different energies.
Yep.
The mechanics had to shift to account for that.
Yeah, for sure. I think one of the big things that one of the big shifts that took place that I don't think gets talked about as much because it's not strictly a mechanical thing, but which feeds into this sense of how the game has changed, since 1974, since 1979, is the idea that one thing that third edition did was when it took the collection of rules that were second edition AD&D at that point, reformatted them, repackaged them, came up with much better expressions for the existing mechanics, was they established that the intent of the game was to play it from first to 20th level complete, right? And that's something that was true throughout third edition. It's something that fourth edition doubled down on or tripled down on, I guess, because the fourth edition went to 30th level with
Mm-hmm.
the expectation that you were supposed to play that. And it's something that fifth edition picked up. And it's the one thing that I was disappointed about when fifth edition dropped, just because, again, it's one of those things that, like, unless you like, people who were playing back in the day, you talk to people about this, and it's something that you wouldn't even think about unless you were there. The idea that um, in the AT&T days, you didn't necessarily have the impetus to run all the way up to 20th level. There were, in fact, disincentives to doing so in a lot of cases, right? Because even though, like, if you're playing like a fighter or a cleric, for example, you keep getting your increases as you increase in level, right? Your attacks go up, and you get more spells and so on and so forth. But at some point, you stop getting your full hit points, right? You reach a plateau at which you get a little bit easier to kill if you're going to continue to take on increasingly powerful foes, right?
Mm-hmm.
And in a lot of cases, talking about resource management and the idea, of like a survival horror game, at some point, AD&D became the opposite of that. It became a game where you were expected to sort of manage a territory and a stronghold. And it was very explicit in the rules. When your character reached ninth level or 10th level, you had the opportunity to build a keep or build a stronghold or to build a temple
Yeah,
or what have you, right? Or to make a thieves guild, right? And the experience, I think, of a lot of people playing AD&D was you got to ninth level or 10th or 12th, and you felt like you were done. Not like, oh, we're bored now, but that was where the campaign sort of naturally ended, right? Because you had accomplished everything you wanted to accomplish narratively, right?
yeah,
You had completed your own heroic arc. And because there was no sense of, oh, I've got to grind to get to 20 because I want that sweet capstone ability, right? In AD&D, there were only a couple of classes that actually had real, what you'd call capstone abilities all the way up to the highest levels. And those were the classes that were fixed in levels, like the monk and the druid, right? Um, and yeah, that was something, I mean, that was, to me, that was a feature of AD&D. It wasn't a bug. It wasn't like, oh, this game, runs out of options at past 12th level, so we have to quit. It was like, this game, the sweet spot for this game is up to 10th or 12th level, right?
yeah.
That's where the game is the most fun.
Which,
And that was something that third edition explicitly moved away from, and which fifth edition has explicitly stayed away from.
yeah.
And I
Although
think it's
they
pretty
can't
telling.
there's an issue of commitment.
Yes. Well, yeah, that's another part of it as well. Like, if you survey after survey, and when people, I think D&D Beyond even has done some numbers.
Yeah, I've seen those.
You know,
I did a whole video
Sure.
going a bit further into that whole high level drop off problem. And
Yeah, what I mean, it's
I
not even a
think
high level drop off. Like between 6th and 8th level, a lot of people just say, "Yeah, we're done.
I think
You know, we've had fun.
the
That's where the campaign
problem
ends."
is a lot of people will say, well, things just get boring at that level. And I think the bigger problem is a hyper focus on that on that first level experience, on that new player experience,
Sure.
to the expense of of others, and not giving a whole lot of guidance in terms of how to build more advanced encounters for GMs and the like. So they end up
Sure.
building the kind of encounters that they would at lower levels, which doesn't exactly work at that point when you've got an expanded kit.
Yeah.
And this is why I had said that the whole, oh, it gets boring at high levels isn't telling the whole problem, because this is a problem on multiple facets. Um,
Sure.
I around that time I was doing a bit of digging into why so many people were dissatisfied with World of Warcraft, especially the rating. And one of the things
Ah,
that was brought up was how there was this hyper focus on the world first crowd, which is a fraction of a minority. But
right.
because of the fact it focused on that, a lot of more casual or semi pro levels of players or guilds didn't have the level of coordination to be able to clear those particular um raids. And I said I'm seeing the opposite issue, that once you're past the first few levels, you're not given a whole lot of support aside from higher numbers. Uh, and funny thing, fourth edition actually attempted to address this with the DM's Guide 2, going into a lot of detail on things like alternate rewards and
Sure.
Paragon level adventures. There probably should have been an
Yeah.
Epic tier one, but that never happened. But
Yeah.
there was at least an attempt.
Yeah.
And it's one of those things where it would be easy to say, oh, things just get too easy, but it's more of when you've got a bunch of moving parts. Sometimes
Yeah.
it's important to keep maintaining those moving parts as the kit expands.
For sure. Yeah.
But
I think what gets really tricky with 5e for high level play, and I know there's, been part of lots of different conversations about this. I think there's the I mean, high level play is difficult just because as the characters get more powerful, it gets more difficult for a DM to challenge them.
mhm,
And it gets difficult to sort of think your way through all the things that could possibly happen, right?
mhm.
Um, but I think, and this for me, I mean, like what you said about trying to relive the first level experience, that sense of oomph that you get when you're a brand new character just kind of starting out. Um, I think D&D 5th edition has a very interesting feel to it. I mean, 3rd edition did this to some degree as well, but 5th edition I think pushes it a little bit farther. And it's this idea that it starts out being a heroic game and then turns into a super heroic game at some point. And there's nothing wrong with that. Lots
But
of people play 5e.
you gotta commit.
You have to commit to that. Yeah, it's a thing that you can't. You sort of that has to be the style of play that you want to embrace, right? Um, and I think for a lot of folks, they just sort of feel like the more powerful the characters get, the challenges feel less personal, right? The challenges are still mechanically robust. If you got a good DM, if that DM knows how to escalate things,
Mhm.
to build really good, tier 3 and tier 4 encounters, you can have a great time. But the stakes often don't feel um like your character and you as a player are as close to them as you were at lower levels. And I often wonder whether that's a thing, which I mean, that's probably pretty unquantifiable. I don't think that's anything you could ever get data on, but I often wonder if that's in part of the issue where sort of
I've
high level play drops off.
I've seen it addressed in a few ways.
Yeah.
Obvious stuff like Adventure Conqueror King system really doubles down on on that three tier approach that it has, where you're a solo adventurer at the start, then you start getting followers, and then you start getting holdings at the end game.
Yep.
There's also the Scion trilogy from White Wolf, where you start off as where you're going from hero, i.e., the kind of Greek hero who's a descendant of a god or goddess, then going into demigod where you are, well, a demigod, and then finally becoming new gods yourself and facing off against the Titans, who up until that point you've only been fighting their minions.
Sure.
Uh, that
Yeah.
I think it's something that can be done, but again, it comes down to commitment. And when you really look at the way certain things have been designed in something like D&D, there's a whole lot of wishy-washy, a whole lot of
Yeah.
not really picking a lane, because there's this idea of, oh, this needs to be an omni game. You can, unless you make a game a universalist, you can never make an omni game.
Sure.
But as a closing off thing, what are your plans for future developments with Core 20? I know it's still technically in playtest form.
Yeah, I mean the playtest version of the game that's out now is, I mean, it's not like a sample of the game. It's not like here's, the first third of it or what have you. The version that's out right now is effectively rules complete. Right? The player's guide has everything in it that a player and a DM need to know in order to run the game. Right? It's got all the information that you could possibly need at the game to build characters, to build campaigns, to build, the world of the game in any way that you want. There's enough of a selection. I think there's 180 monsters in the creature compendium playtest. That's sort of like a small subset of what would eventually be in a full creature compendium. So that's sort of like just shaved down. There's no specific GM's guide. There's a very small guide just sort of talking about some of the mechanical stuff. But one of the things that I've always thought would be useful would just be to make sure that all the rules of the game are actually in the player's guide, right? Whether you're a player or a GM, having everything in one place just always seemed to make more sense to me, right? So that's something that I set out to do with this playtest, and which is part of the reason why the books are both pretty hefty. At some point, I want to, getting great feedback from people that are running the games. A lot of folks just kind of emailing. We've got a Discord as well that people are welcome to drop in on. Yeah, everybody who's read it seems to like it. Everybody who's playing it seems to enjoy it, which I'm hoping is a good sign. At some point, the plan is to do an official release, but I wanted to get as many eyes on it, just sort of playtesting the core of the game, as it were, as possible before that happens. So that's the point of the playtest process of this playtest process, which I guess, I mean, we'll call this the open playtest process. The game has been in closed playtest for quite some time now, and it's had it's gone through a substantial amount of revision, added all sorts of new things to it, took things in different directions, at a few different points in its development, right? So yeah, at some point, a full release is the plan. So hopefully, maybe early next year, I think would be a good thing to shoot for.
Yeah, I can get that. With that said, I do want to sincerely thank you for taking the time out of your schedule to come all the way to my temple and enjoy the madness that happens around here.
My pleasure.
And anytime you see fit to return, the door is always open. As I often say around here, drinking is not mandatory, but it is encouraged. And, of course, a sincere thanks goes out to everyone who took the time out of their schedule to come onto the show and enjoy the madness. And there'll be plenty more where that came from, as there always is here, on the open bar of the internet. But until then, on behalf of the good brothers present and not present, my name is Mildra. I am your gaming monk. Stay fucking frosty, everybody.